The US just did something that China never expected. They bombed Iran. Or to be specific, they attacked 3 of Iran's nuclear sites. My phone has been blowing up with all these alerts about the airstrike last week. Some say that the US has just plunged itself into a war in the Middle East. And the US government says that they've completely destroyed Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons. As a China watcher, I spent my whole week trying to figure out what does this mean for China? And did China just lose this opportunity to become the new broker in the Middle East? By the time that this video is filmed, there has been a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. So whatever the US government did, it seems that it worked, at least for now. Based on the news report so far, this military attack is called Operation Midnight Hammer. The mission involved over 125 military aircraft. It included powerful bunker buster bombs that were targeting these secret underground facilities. This seems to have also emboldened the Taiwanese president. So soon after the airstrike, he came out as part of his serial speech addressing the Taiwanese public, saying that Taiwan is definitely not part of China and anybody who's a real Taiwanese citizen should be anti-Chinese Communist Party, be anti-CCP. And just to be clear, this is in clear contrast of what he said at his 1-year anniversary inaugural speech, where he very much avoided taking such a strong stance against the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party. As I watched this unfolds, my first question was, why now? We know that military option has always been on the table with the US when it comes to Iran. But up until this point, the presidents of the United States have always been consistent with economic sanctions and diplomatic measures when it comes to Iran. As I was doing the research, I came across this old report that kind of predicted how the US would interact with Iran for the following years. And it also gives me a glimpse of what is guiding the US decisions when it comes to containing Iran's nuclear power. This report is written by a nuclear expert. It is sponsored by a nonpartisan apolitical think tank that offers analysis to the US military. The report laid out 2 ways to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Well, the first one is to change their mind. That means using economic sanctions or diplomatic pressure to convince Iran that the cost of developing nuclear weapons is too high. Even now, a lot of experts in the US believe that using those 2 measures in the long term is the ultimate way to contain Iran. After years of implementing those measures, it doesn't seem that it's working.
Oh, he did worse than nothing. I wish he did nothing. If he did nothing, we might be in the clear right now. What he actually did was enter the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, with the regime and unfroze $150 billion. And I think it's really important to put that obscene amount of money into perspective. $150 billion. You could build a country with that money. There's a book by Jay Solomon called The Iran Wars, where he talks about how Obama actually foiled human rights programs that were documenting the violations in Iran, all as part of this deal to engage with in these diplomatic relations with the regime. And then you have to ask, is it really that surprising that we are where we are now? What did the West think would happen if you keep empowering these terrorists, if you're making deals with ISIS? Like, what do you think the end result of that is? Freedom and safety for all?
As I was watching this dissident talking about how she wished that they did nothing, it kind of reminded me of what I think when it comes to US policy on China. The US also thought that through economic cooperation, China would one day eventually become a democracy. And we all know how that turned out. So the second way to contain Iran is if you can't change their mind, you destroy their capabilities. So that means mainly using military attacks to ultimately destroy Iran's ability ability to make such weapons, and airstrikes is on top of the experts list. In the report, it suggested that military options, remember this is in early 2000, military options could be considered if the enrichment rate exceeds 20%. And there's been credible reports and investigation that show Iran has far passed that threshold. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, as of May, Iran has already enriched over 400 kilograms of uranium to 60%. Just 42 kilograms of 90 purity is enough for a bomb. Iran could get there in just weeks. Iran and the US are not the only country that was analyzed in this report. Another player was also mentioned, and as a China watcher, that part of the report was kind of eye-opening for me. The report noted several motives for China to back Iran, and also some motives for China to hold back on a stronger stance for Iran if it really comes to a war. To be honest, if you grew up in China, the Middle East doesn't really come up in our education. We hear about how evil and bad the US is, and that is pretty much all we talk about when it comes to international politics. So for me, the Middle East is kind of this far away region that has very little to do with us. Oh boy, was I wrong. Simply put, these countries are both authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. They suppress free speech, they jail their dissidents, and there's very little freedom left for their citizens. For example, Iran shuts down mobile internet when there is a protest. And of course, we all know China has a great firewall that stops people from accessing the internet. The Iranian regime has also provided substantial resources and weapons to terrorist groups, including Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas. But as someone who grew up in an authoritarian regime, what really scares me is these two regimes have been working together. China is basically keeping Iran alive, while the world is implementing sanctions on Iran for building nukes and supporting terrorist groups designated by many democracies in the world. China has become Iran's biggest oil buyer. And not just that, they also invest a lot of money in the region. So while the world is cutting Iran off, China is basically writing the checks. And it's not just trade. The two regimes are also helping with each other's surveillance system on their citizens. For example, Iran purchased Chinese surveillance tech, including facial recognition software and crowd control gear. So these two regimes' domestic control systems are basically feeding off each other. So it makes sense when the US launched airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, the Chinese state media had a much stronger response. State media Global Times accused the US of pouring fuel on the flames, 火上浇油, that basically means making the situation worse. This is in clear contrast when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Chinese state media avoided using the word invasion and blamed NATO expansion for the conflict. If you're still with me so far now, we've talked about Iran and China. We've talked about what the US think about their way of controlling or containing Iran's nuclear ambitions. One thing that still puzzled me was, what does this mean for China? China has been trying to present itself as the peacemaker, and the US, on the other hand, has kind of lost its credibility in the region after its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. The Middle East is of great importance for the Chinese Communist Party. As an authoritarian regime, China has always been trying every way to sort of counter the democratic values. But it hasn't been easy for China because many countries in the Middle East are kind of in the US orbit of diplomatic ties. But that changed in March 2023 when it surprised the world by brokering a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's been really good news for China, particularly because these Muslim countries have been towing the line with China when it comes to Xinjiang, probably most criticized human rights issue in China right now. So Pakistan and Iran have both softened their accusation, oh, including Turkey, have all softened their accusation on the, I guess, crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. But it doesn't mean that China would always have Iran's back. And what we've seen since the airstrike is there's a lot of non-action, strong words coming out of the Chinese Communist Party. No one really benefits. Even China doesn't benefit from a nuclear weapon-powered Iranian regime. Unlike Russia, China doesn't benefit from increased oil price, especially considering the economic downturn that's happening in China right now. In the report that I mentioned earlier in this video, it does warn the US officials that if they were to use airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities, China might use Iran as a bargaining chip with the US. But when the US asked China for help, it seemed that China is unwilling to sort of intervene, let alone use it as a bargaining chip. I think my biggest takeaway from this, from a week of, researching and reading on Iran and China in the US, is maybe sometimes it is wishful thinking to think that your opponent would change, or that somehow because they're richer or you've been civil with them and you've implemented all these diplomatic and economic sanctions, that the other side would compromise. I just think sometimes no matter how much you want it to happen, maybe it just can't. And we all have to be okay with that.